Well
Okay.
done.
Oh, thank you. If I'm yelling because I have earphones in, I'm sorry.
No, no, you're fine.
Okay.
Oh,
So if you would like to go ahead and start by stating your name and then also how what time period you lived in Champaign-Urbana.
yes. My name is Mary Lee Sargent, and I moved to Champaign with my husband at the time in 1966. He took a job at the university as a professor in psychology. And in 1970, I came out as a lesbian and stayed there until 2003 when my partner and I moved to New Hampshire. So my time there was really roughly 66 to 2003, and I was an active member of the lesbian community. Really, it took me from 1970 to 73 to really leave my marriage. But I was beginning to come out and, be involved in women's and feminist and lesbian events and things. And by 1973, I was, fully out and partnered and, um, till now. Um, and my career, I'll just say, was teaching at Parkland College in Champaign. I taught women's studies and history, and was there really from 1968 until I left town in 2003. I retired and moved with my partner to Concord, New Hampshire.
Very cool. So what were some of the resources that you had in regards to coming out in the community? Like, what?
That's a good question. I think that because I was politically, well, I considered myself radical, progressive, politically progressive. I had been trying to come out, I would say, since before I was married. But given that I was reared in Texas in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, I'm 72 now, so there just were no gay people, in evidence. I remember going to see the Children's Hour. We had like one movie that even dealt with homosexuality, Tea and Sympathy, the Children's Hour. When I was in college, I was reading all the just crappy things that were out there. There was not much that at least I could find. So, it was a very long process. But once I was 30 in 1970 and was a raving feminist, then it wasn't really difficult. I mean, I didn't have struggles that I would have had earlier coming out in Texas as a younger person. Um, but, I had the support of feminists who were all of us kind of coming out in some way or another. And I also was involved in the kind of startup of a battered women's shelter, uh, a woman's place, which opened in 1971. And that seemed to attract feminists, some of whom were lesbian. And so I began to know lesbians through a woman's place. And I was attracted to it because of my, feminist identity. And that place seemed to attract. So what happened is about 1972, 73, there was a support group that was, volunteering at the center, but for our own self, it was really an early consciousness raising group within feminism. And in that group, we then began to be friends and a social network. And at just about that time, gay bars began to open up, and we would go, after our support group meetings for a woman's place, which was our, political work. We would go to one of the bars, and the first one I remember going to was called the Balloon Saloon, and I'm sure if you talk to people, you'll, hear that name. And then you meet other women there. And we tended to be what I'd call kind of middle class, mostly tied to education. And at the bars, we didn't really interact much, but there would be women who were working class, they had their own networks, and then there were women that were real tied to sports, which most of us were not. And we saw those women, really, there wasn't a lot of cross mixing. And that's one of the things I covered in my paper, that I sent you the title of, Bar Dykes, Ball Diamonds, and Battle Axes. And I was really dealing with three different groups of women, and I interviewed a bunch of women for that. Working class women I'm calling the Bar Dykes because that was really their social center. We had other places we socialized, like in homes. We would have support groups. There was a whole evolving lesbian community. By 1975, we had the newsletter that I think I mentioned, Lavender Prairie News. We would meet, to produce that. We put on all kinds of events that were open to lesbians. We did things like celebrate birthdays. Like I always had a Virgo party that we would advertise in the Lavender Prairie News that was to try to, say, hey, if you're looking for friends and a community, come to the Virgo party, come to the Libra party. So there was a social thing that evolved. I'd say by 1975 it was well established.
So that's very exciting. So you had mentioned a women's place or a woman's place. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. A woman's place was one of the early, in this phase of feminism, one of the early battered women's shelters or domestic violence. At that time, we were calling it battered women's shelters, but it's domestic violence shelter. And it was begun by two lesbians in their home, right on, oh my gosh, corner of Race and something. I can't even remember now where it was, the early one. But it was their private home. And somehow I heard about this place and that they needed volunteers and went there. And it just evolved because at first it was all volunteer. It was in these women's home. They had bought a duplex in Urbana, and they lived on one side, this lesbian couple, with a couple of other women that weren't lesbian, just feminist, women. And the other side was for women in transition. And early on, it was any woman that was going through some transition in her life. What happened is, so from 71 to, I'd say, 74, to 71 to 73, it was just very informal. But all of a sudden, there began to be funding through domestic violence acts and so forth at the state and federal level. And we applied for that funding, so you had to formalize. And also by that time, the women needed their home, and we actually found another house in Champaign this time, rented it, hired a staff person, had to have a structured board because to get the funding, we had to become more formal. And that happened gradually. It was a gradual evolution to, I think there's been 4 places in Champaign and Urbana since 1971. And now a woman's place is out on, oh my gosh, near the Champaign County Nursing Home, whatever that street, Main, when you in Urbana, if you go out East Main Street, about 10, 11 years ago, they built or maybe 12 by this time, a very permanent site. But it had 3 other sites before that. But it became more and more structured and more a social service agency. But it started very much as a feminist volunteer consensus run, mess, because, that's the way things are. And much more radical in some ways because, we didn't have funders, we didn't have the state, needing reports, and we didn't have paid staff. But because that was kind of the only game in town where feminists were more, and I shouldn't say um, more radical feminists, I'd say, were attracted to a woman's place. And so, and a number of them were lesbians. So that's kind of the genesis of the active lesbian community. It morphed into the newsletter, Lavender Prairie News, and into various uh, consciousness raising groups, support groups, friendship groups that socialized together, did political actions together, did rituals. I mean, we were all into kind of Wiccan spirituality, and we're having, hollow mass ceremonies at the Wesley Foundation, and it would all be pretty much organized by lesbians and a few heterosexual feminists that were our friends, because our community was never exclusively lesbian, but it was very exclusively women. And at that time, I mean, there was not a lot of interaction with gay men. I mean, I had individual gay male friends, but I wasn't in groups other than an AA group I went to much later in life, in the late 80s, that was a gay lesbian AA group. Um, and and I had some gay male friends, and I was hearing about what they were doing, because they were having dinner clubs that had dinner together. They weren't as visible as we were. I would say the women were much more. We had this ongoing newsletter that really went for 20 years about, and so I think we were more visible than maybe the men and what they were doing. But later on, I mean, and I was political all along and involved in feminist activities. But in 1999, I formed with another woman in town something called the 85% Coalition, and that was very much males and females, mostly gay, and some allies, trying to get the Illinois Human Rights Act amended to include sexual orientation. And we had been working on that for 25 years, really. But we really thought that we had a chance to get it and organize more formally in '99. This 85% coalition that was mostly Champaign-Urbana, LGBTQ, and ally people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we did finally get it in 2003 or 4. I can't remember when the act was amended, but we did direct action, all kinds of, direct action, chased our around the state when they were speaking, to pressure them, because they were Republicans and they were opposed to the House bills that we were working for. So I had much more political connection with men, 99, and before, when I was doing just individual acts with men for that human rights amendment. But not, it was a real, and I don't, it was separatist in the sense that we just really were hanging with women and men were hanging with men in Champaign-Urbana. I don't think, other than, individual friendships, there was a lot, there weren't organizations, at least that I was a part of, that were mixed groups. We had no ACT UP group, because those tended to be very mixed. I wanted us to have one, but I was busy with groups. As I tell people when I talk about my activism, I say I've been, as an individual, about 7 or 8 different groups, with, right now in New Hampshire, I'm New Hampshire Lesbians for Peace. And, so. political activists and one, queer.
So, I am unsure if the recorder got that last part, but it was cutting in and out for a second.
Okay, let me just repeat one thing.
Okay.
Um, and unfortunately, I wish I could remember what I just said. I, I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. What I
Yeah.
did hear was you were discussing that you have been very politically active, and
Yes.
you were a member of how many groups did you say probably?
Well, that's sort of a joke, but I said
Yeah.
I alone was 7 or 8 groups, and
Yeah.
the groups I was in, and they were very heavily lesbian, but there were straight women also. In 1981, I co-founded a group that was extremely active from 1981 until about 93, and it was called the Grassroots Group of Second Class Citizens. And we organized to do direct action for the Equal Rights Amendment. Do you know about the Equal Rights Amendment to
Uh,
the U.S. Constitution?
I actually do not.
Okay. Feminists started as soon as suffrage was passed in 1920, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, they started working for the Equal Rights Amendment because so many laws in the states treated men and women differently because our whole legal system is based on English common law. And under English common law, married women lost all their legal identity. And the doctrine was called femme couverte, meaning that the woman's identity in marriage is covered by her husband. So there were, just hundreds of laws at the state level that treated women differently, particularly married women, but even single women too in certain situations. So the Equal Rights Amendment was an amendment to the Constitution, proposed amendment, I should say, in 1923 to get rid of all these legal discriminations. And the amendment stated equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. So basically, that negative language is saying, you can't pass a law that discriminates between men and women. This amendment got nowhere from 1923 till about 1972. 1972, it was a very liberal Congress. It passed and was sent out to the states to be ratified because, as I'm sure you know, it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment to the federal Constitution. It got 35 states in Illinois. So in 81, there was a deadline, June 30th of 82. If we didn't have 38 states, the whole amendment would go down to defeat. And Illinois had not ratified it, even though it had been the first state to ratify the women's suffrage movement amendment back in 1919. It had not ratified it, partly because there was a special rule that it took a 60% majority to ratify in the state legislature to ratify a constitutional amendment. And we could never get the 60% in each house in the same session. It was very frustrating. So from 72 until 81, we kept trying to get it. So in 81, I got desperate, and some of my friends, and we said, one thing we haven't done that the suffrage movement did do, and that is direct action, more dramatic protests, sit-ins, getting uh, chambers and while they're in session and yelling or whatever we had to do to get attention. So we formed the Grassroots Group of Second Class Citizens, and the name, of course, is focusing on the fact that without the equal rights amendment, we are second class citizens in the United States. And so we formed this organization, and we did do direct action in order to get the Illinois legislature to ratify. And um, most, I should say most of us were lesbian, not all. And we very prominently, because we got a lot of publicity, we were on the news every night. We got on the national news because it was a national story, in that if Illinois and 2 other states didn't ratify, the whole thing for all women would go down to defeat. So we all wore our, double women's signs and, all kinds of things to promote lesbian visibility while we were doing this larger feminist action. And the photographer Annie Leibovitz, I don't know if you know who she is, but she's probably one of the most famous photographers in the United States, was on assignment for Life magazine, and she came to photograph everybody, all the groups that were working for the ERA, and we were one of the groups, and we were the ones she chose to put in the special edition of Life magazine that they used to put out at the end of every year, called The Year in Pictures. And so there we all are, with our lesbian paraphernalia, all chained together, because we chained ourselves, and so forth, to bring attention to the cause. So the grassroots group of second-class citizens was that group, and we just did tons of feminist and lesbian actions, for lesbian rights, for abortion rights, for, violence against women, anti-pornography stuff, all kinds of actions. And then we also formed a national organization called Women Rising in Resistance and Lesbians Rising in Resistance. And we did all kinds of things, like we reclaimed the Statue of Liberty in 1986 for women, and, just wild things. But, very effective in that we were, again, promoting lesbian visibility and promoting feminist causes. So that was kind of my trajectory from A Woman's Place, which I was very involved in, until I'd say the mid-'80s. And at the same time, I was, co-founding and kind of being a leader of grassroots group of second-class citizens and Women Rising in Resistance. I was kind of the national coordinator of that, and of Lesbians Rising in Resistance. And the other groups were just little, very specific. Like one was Women Decorating Champagne, and that was spray painting fraternities where rapes were occurring. Spray painting rapists live here, and, undercover secret kinds of things. And so we didn't want to use our name, so we would use other names that we just would make up temporarily. So that's the kind of thing I was involved in. But having a lot of fun also, because we also were doing social things like our party, the birthday month parties, the Holomas, the May Day. We had a maypole out at Lodge Park in Monticello on May Day, and we would advertise it and invite all women to come, and we would dance, and it was fun times, heady times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was it like being involved with national movements and in Champaign? Was it in Champaign-Urbana? Was that a difficulty, or?
No, it wasn't difficult. It was just we didn't have the communication at the high. I mean, the kind of thing we have now, Skype and email and so forth. So everything was on the phone and by mail. And I had a full-time job, so I was doing all my activism. I'm kind of a type A personality anyway, but I was doing my activism, like after work. And so, it was not easy, because you're, as I told people, my paying work pays for my political work, because, there was no money involved, hardly at all. And so I was paying my own phone bills and stamps and all that. But yeah, it was very interesting. We did a number of national actions, and I went to national marches and things like that, the gay and lesbian marches that happened in Washington. We would always be a presence at those, and so it was just there. we weren't like, because I was so involved in other things, as I mentioned, I really wanted us to have an ACT UP chapter where men and women would be working together, but just didn't have the oomph to organize one more thing. So we just didn't get that in our community.
Yeah,
Yeah.
understandably so.
Right. Right.
So you had mentioned that within these groups, they were often not exclusively lesbian. They were actually very much so lesbian and feminist. And so what were some of the, I know a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to get more people involved. And one of the things that is constantly brought up is the concept of like resources that you can provide individuals within the community, such as childcare. So like,
Yes.
what were some of the things that were in place to allow more people from different groups to interact?
Unfortunately, we were very poor at that. We were so busy. There were like the music festivals, which I wasn't involved in organizing. A lot of lesbians were involved in, because the National Women's Music Festival began in Champaign-Urbana in the 70s sometime. I can't remember, 75, 74, around in there. And I was so involved in other things that I wasn't on the organizing committees. And they were, I think the festivals were more aware that they needed to make money to cover, it was such a much more expensive thing than we were involved in. And they did organize child care. We did not. And most of the women who came to us did not have children. This was kind of because our daughter's a lesbian, and she wants to have children as soon as she finishes her PhD next year with her, and her partner just finished hers. So it was a different time. There was not, and not to say there weren't lesbians that had kids, but we just were completely insensitive to their needs in terms of providing, other than on a friendship basis. We didn't provide child care for most of our events, in that most of us didn't have children and we were just not aware. And there's so many things. I think the music festivals, the women's music festivals, educated all of us about having signers, at public events, to sign, to have child care, to have alcohol-free space because of addiction problems. And we were just oblivious, to that. And we were small groups, basically, and mostly working locally, doing things locally, did lots of programming. We brought speakers. We brought Andrea Dworkin and so many, Audre Lorde, and we worked with the Women's Studies Department a lot because I sat on the advisory committee to sort of represent lesbian and radical feminist concerns on that advisory committee for the University Women's Studies Department. Well, I don't even know what it's called now. I think Women and Gender Studies. But and together would bring big name feminist Bella Abzug and other people. So, but we didn't, except for the big public events and big national conferences, like in 1986, there was the National Women's Studies Association conference, and a lot of us active lesbians helped organize that. And there, for something like that, we did organize child care and had signers. But for a lot of our smaller community activities, we didn't. And it probably did keep some women, lesbians, and just feminists with children away because we didn't provide that. But we didn't get a critique either. We were responsive. I mean, when you're a political person, I mean, the criticism is happening all the time, and we didn't get criticized about it. So the people that needed us or wanted to be with these radical feminists either didn't have children, or they didn't expect, or they were too quiet to criticize us. Mm-hmm. So, and I think the only way that we reached out across is that we were just open to women. We never said these are lesbian-only events or anything like that. And mostly who wants to be with other lesbians are lesbians, or at least very lesbian-friendly straight women. And, and that tended to be very progressive women, or very ultra-feminist women who, even if they were in a relationship with a man, they were very comfortable and supportive of gay and lesbian people. Yeah.
So, someone in a previous interview had mentioned that at one point it seemed as though there were neighborhoods, like so where individuals would all live, and so he had mentioned that gay men were kind of in the Lincoln Square area, and then lesbians were in Champaign,
Mm-hmm.
but he couldn't tell me where because he was unsure.
Okay. I would say that we kind of congregated in. Now, see, this is getting at a class thing, too. This is women who were in professional jobs who could afford to buy a home. As far as, women who were living in apartments or who were students, they were all over the place near the university. And I don't know where they congregated. But as far as, professional women with the means to buy a home, it tended to be in Champaign, kind of near Prospect Avenue. Some west in all these, like there are these streets like John, Charles, Healy, Daniel, da-da-da, that run west of am I thinking of the right street? Yes, Prospect. And some lived on, the east side of Prospect, but it was kind of in that general neighborhood. Really, it kind of picture the corner, if you can, of Springfield Avenue and Prospect Avenue. Do you know those? Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of that's that was the center of at least that subgroup of lesbians. In terms of, I knew, of course, a lot of younger lesbians who were still students or just starting out in jobs and were renting, and they kind of tended to be between Prospect Avenue and Neal Street. Like in Church, University, there were a lot of apartments. A number were clustering around there if you were renting.
Mm-hmm.
If you were buying, you tended to be a little further west.
Yeah. Separate yourself from campus a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Though we were on campus constantly, doing things. Like we always had a rally on Halloween to talk about women's issues. We always had, because we called it a witch in, or witches aid, because farmers aid was a big deal that happened at the stadium, the U of I stadium, that Willie Nelson and a bunch of people organized in the 80s to bring attention to farm issues and farm problems, and so we just played off of that and called Witches Aid. And so we always did a big rally at the Union, in the south porch of the Union, on Halloween. We always did one on International Women's Day, which is March 8th. We usually did one, trying to think other times we did one. Just to commemorate certain events, like on December 1st, this man murdered a bunch of women in Montreal at one of the universities, and we would have a spontaneous rally. So we were on the campus a lot doing that. Oh, and we did have a student group, a grassroots group, student group, funded by SORF, it was called at that time, the Student Organization Something Fund. And so we were meeting on campus.
Very cool. So that seems to suggest that there was a wide range of individuals that showed up in regards to age and points in life and everything.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, and I'd say at our larger lesbian events, we did have, again, it was still pretty much women either in education or tied to education or to the professions. So there was a kind of educated middle class thing going on. And as I said, when I did my presentation, which I gave numerous times, this lesbian community from 1970 to whatever the dates I had, 95, I think. Um, they really saw us, the Bardykes and the softball jock women saw us as these snooty lesbians, who were, educated and didn't speak the way they did. And, so there was definitely a class divide, but it was never antagonistic from our side or theirs. I mean, there was never any mixing it up, but it was very separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we were, and that's not to say there weren't women whose origins were working class. There were a lot of those women in our group, but they were, upwardly mobile and getting advanced degrees and hoping to go into professions of some kind.
Yeah. So you had mentioned the Wesley Foundation. Can you talk a little bit more about church, like churches and their part?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because the Wesley Foundation was always friendly to us meeting there. We had no real formal connection. I was invited to speak at various things because Wesley had some kind of fund called the Baker Fund so I think somebody left to them to do programming for women. And so they would occasionally have a lesbian program, and I spoke several times at those programs. But mostly it was just the foundations were open to have meetings, groups meet there, and sometimes it cost money and sometimes it didn't. And if you had a friend that worked there, which we did, there was a lesbian who was one of the assistant ministers at Wesley. And so, of course, we could get free space there. And the other place we could always get free space was the McKinley Foundation. And they were very open and friendly. And the UCC church on campus, I don't know why we didn't think of them. I guess we just didn't have any connections there, though the first lesbian wedding I was ever in, and it wasn't legal or anything, but this was in the 70s. 1974 was at the campus UCC church, and the minister there at the time was very gay friendly, and the UCC was one of the first mainline Protestant denominations to be open to both lesbian and gay clergy and members, but we didn't really use that, meet there, and I think we just didn't know anyone there. Later on, like in the early 90s, a center started at the Disciples Foundation, the church on the corner of Springfield and, oh my God, I'm losing the street names. The main one that's next to 6th Street, Wright Street. Yeah, okay. Springfield and Wright, I think it is. But anyway, it's had a progressive center started there because they had a very progressive assistant minister, and we started meeting there a lot too, and having events there. I forgot to mention one of the most wonderful events we did was the Lesbian Variety Show, and that got to be a really big deal. And that started in the 70s and went well into oh my gosh, I don't know when the last one was, into the 90s. And it just got bigger and bigger and more professional and bigger venues. And we had it in all those places. We had it at the Disciples Foundation. We had it at Wesley one time. We had it at McKinley. We had it at Hillel one time. And it just got to be the biggest kind of event of the season. Usually it was end of April or early May before everybody left school. But we had a group that performed every year called the Les Preems, and they did, they did a lot of Supreme songs, but with new lesbian words, and it was just great fun. I was always in it, doing a skit of some kind, and so that was one of the fun things we did.
That sounds really awesome.
But I don't remember women struggling about religion. I don't know if we were all atheists or agnostics or what. It was just kind of a non-issue. We had feminist seders for Passover because we had Jewish women, and we would rewrite the whole seder. Or they did, the Jewish women rewrote the whole seder, and we would get drunk, on Mogen David wine and Manischewitz, and because you drink. At various points you do toasts and not sloppy drunk, but tipsy, on this wine, and we would eat all the food you're supposed to eat at Passover and do this feminist thing. And we took it very seriously. I mean, it was because the Jewish women were not totally observant, but still felt a connection. And some of our women were religious, but most of them weren't in the 70s, 80s, or at least they didn't talk about it if they were.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that's why I think in a way, because we came to it through feminism and most of us weren't very religious, there didn't, I'm not going to say there wasn't any suffering because women got fired. Women who worked for the Girl Scouts got fired, not in the Champaign, whatever they call it, area or region, but in other regions, people were in the closet at work, but there wasn't a lot of angsting and torture. Some were alienated from their families. There was probably more of that in the 70s and 80s because I also had lots of contact with students over the years. And because I, at one time, counted up that I'd had over 8,000 students. Just the nature of you teach 4 or 5, and we were on the quarter system for a part of the time, and it was just huge numbers. And I feel like we had a higher percentage of alienation from family than the general population, but it's based on no real data. It's just, observational, belief that we did have more of that kind of suffering.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you came to Champaign in 73, which was right around when, or no, sorry, you came out when you were 70.
I came, yeah.
So
3, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
3-year process. That's okay.
But so 73 was actually the year that the Human Rights Ordinance in Urbana was passed that included LGBT, and then 75 was Champaign.
Yes.
So
Right.
Were you involved in those?
I was not involved in those because that was at the height of my involvement in A Woman's Place,
Mm-hmm.
and in building. I would say my causes were A Woman's Place and building lesbian community, and I was not yet focused on LGBT politics in the formal sense. So no, I had nothing to do with that at all. I did become friends later on with people who had been, but I had not anything to do with that and didn't even know it was happening until it had happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned also that most of the communication was via mail and or phone. So what were ways that you spread the word around the community about events and tried to recruit members?
Postering, flyering, going to the campus and setting up tables because you could, in the South Lounge or little entry area, you could set up a table. You reserved the space, so we would flyer at those things. The Lavender Prairie newsletter did reach a fairly large number, several hundred people. So we would always advertise in that. We would put it in newsletters. Every so often, we'd even, advertise, in the newspaper for events. Get a small ad in the News Gazette. A lot of postering, and that's one of the things. As I got older, in my 50s, I thought, how long will I have to do this? Where I'm going out in the cold and tacking up stuff and pasting up stuff and, schlepping in my back of my car all these printed materials. So we used a lot of print shops around town, and um, just those means mostly the old-fashioned, standing on the quad and handing out flyers or tabling at events. Um, and newsletters. We put things in the Now newsletter. We would put things in the see. This is before websites even.
Mm-hmm.
We'd put things in the Women's Studies newsletter just to try to reach a broader. And for a brief time, there was a newsletter just of feminist activities. I can't even remember what it was called, and I think it was done by women over at Wesley Foundation that were feminists, and we'd put it in there. So just the old-fashioned print, media,
Mm-hmm.
posters and newsletters.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So that was that. I was thinking of something. What was I going to say? I feel I had something and then I lost it.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry at all. Um, yeah.
There's something in regards to. Oh, yes. Will you go more in depth and talk about the Prairie newsletter, the Lavender Prairie newsletter?
Yes. There was a collective that put this out monthly, and it was really the best source, I think the best source of kind of what one segment of our lesbian community, the professional, educated, middle class, community. It had announcements of everything we did, stories about every imaginable feminist topic and lesbian topic. Suggestions of books to read, book reviews, movie reviews. And it was I was not on that collective. All my good friends were on it. I mean, and it was really done by, I'd say, anywhere from 3 to 8 women over this 20-year period. And at one time, I had collected all the issues, probably up into the late 90s or mid 90s, because I don't know when it stopped. I've lost that. And I turned it because we had this library that was called the Women's Studies Women in International Development Library. And I think I wrote you, I don't know if that still exists or not. Do you know at the library if it still exists?
I do not believe it does.
I don't think it does either, because I think, like everything, the funding went. And I gave them a whole run of it. And that their collection, I'm sure, went somewhere, and didn't just get thrown away. I mean, it's obviously integrated, I hope, into the main stacks. But that would be something that an archive should have, because it's just a little picture of what the women were doing and thinking, and things like using WOMYN and kind of some kind of separatist talk. But all of us had men in our lives, really. I mean, dads, sons, brothers, so none of us were, that I know of, were ever rigid separatists, but we're feminists and pissed off at men. And so there's some of that flavor by using the word of women. And it's just a good slice of 70s and 80s and how active we were. Because one of the things I often told my feminist students is that, I mean, I didn't say it like this, but in essence what I was saying is I feel sorry that you don't have this incredible active movement to just plug into. Because when you're a newly coming out as a feminist or an activist or political person or as a gay lesbian person, to have a movement to hook onto and communities to attach to, not to have to organize it yourself, because most people are not organizers, and so instead, they may go to the bars or socialize with a few gay friends they find, but we had all these things to tap into, because the battered women's movement, lesbians were starting women's bookstores, and straight women too, but women's bookstores. There was a whole network of those in the 70s and 80s. There were women's restaurants. There were several publishing houses. There were presses, businesses. We had one, I was part of one that was called Woodworks, and it was lesbian owned. And we just bought a woodworking business from a guy, and we were making furniture. And, in the end, the business failed because, like most handicraft businesses, you just can't be paid for your labor. I mean, people pay what it's worth, at least in time that it takes. These were handmade, items. And it was a lesbian-owned business. So, but the 70s and 80s was a very dynamic time for both the feminist community, but also the lesbian community. So later it began to become different. It morphed into something very, very different in the 90s and into the 2000s, so that young lesbians and activists and LGBT activists, it's harder to find those things to attach to. And whereas we had like 10 things you could pick, and attach to one of those things. So that's a real difference. And the Lavender Prairie News, I think, shows you the dynamism and vitality and diversity, of what was going on. And I don't want to be too nostalgic, because I think other things are going on now that are equally exciting, and you can tap in, through the internet now, probably even more than we could. But that's still not the same as a group of companions that you're with, physically.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I just wanted to let you know that I know that the wow, I can't even speak. The Champaign County Historical Archives, which is in the Urbana Free Library, it does have, as far as I know, the entire run of the Lavender Prairie newsletter. So,
excellent.
Just for anyone listening, as well as for your future reference.
That's so good. That's so great. I would love to have my paper put in that archive from this talk that I gave. So, and I need to put it on my website. I thought it was, as I wrote to you, I thought it was on there, and it isn't. So I'm going to get it on, and then I'll, I need to kind of get it into a form, and I don't know who I should send that to get it into that archive, because it's an indirect source, but it's a secondary source, but it's from a participant, in those events.
Yeah, I will actually write it down right now. I can email you the contact information of who I spoke with at the archive, because I'm sure that would be a great pairing to put those in the same area.
Yes, and I also will suggest to them that they get the book I told you about, the Mirror Dance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I actually, as soon as you told me about it, I requested it, so I think it came in today.
Oh, good.
At the library.
Well, remember, I'm Natalie.
Okay, Natalie.
The Queen Lesbian, I'm called in one.
That's awesome.
Okay. Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Let's see. So, we're approaching an hour. One thing that I always like to do is leave a space at the end for anyone to say anything that they didn't get a chance to.
Okay, let me just think about this a moment. What did we do that I haven't mentioned? I will say that there were, of course, softball leagues, that were full of lesbians, and they had their whole social network that was going on. And some of the women in our community were athletes, and so they crossed over into that community. It was pretty separate, but it was very lesbian, and there would be big tournaments, and it was a whole world that I had no part of, but some of our lesbians in our community did participate in that. And gosh, I'm sorry, I'm just so speechless here. I can't think of anything else.
Oh, you've been great. Um,
Now, okay, I don't know if you may not want to record this part because I just wanted to ask you something about yourself and about this project.
okay.
Uh, uh, and it's fine. Now, did you say you're working in collaboration with others, or is this your unique project for yourself?
So I'm currently interning at the Up Center, so I'm doing it on behalf of the Up Center.
Okay, I
Um,
see. Yeah.
yeah, but it's definitely so one of the greatest resources that I had when I was growing up, because
Hmm.
I was in a very rural area without
Yeah.
an actual physical community. What I gained community or the feeling of that through were memoirs. And
Yes.
so it's very much so entrenched in this personal
Yes.
experience within a moment in history. And so I
Yes.
was very excited to be able to be working on this project.
Oh, well, that's great. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's wonderful. And are you and do you identify as lesbian, as gay, or are you?
Yes, I identify as gay.
Okay, you do. Okay.
Hmm.
Well, and have you for a long time? I mean, did you know early in life or?
Yeah, I knew very early on.
Mm,
I grew up in a very Christian conservative household, and so I knew at a very young age and tried to change
yeah.
myself for a long time. And then I ended up coming out when I was 19.
Okay.
So,
Right.
yeah,
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
but I'm sure it must be harder coming from those kind of small communities and very religious homes than what I had. My parents were religious, but liberal,
hmm,
liberal religious, so different.
yeah.
Yeah,
But Champaign and Urbana were great. Like, it's a really great area.
it is. It's
So,
so such great people. I mean, that's one thing I miss because we moved to an area that's physically very beautiful, and I had been raised in North Texas until '66, which was all plains and big sky country and flat and treeless and not much water. And then I moved to Champaign, same thing as far as topography, but the community is so, oh my gosh, it's so fantastic and so alive and dynamic. And this is not a university community, and I just miss that terribly. So I'm so glad you made it from rural outside of Macomb to Champaign Urbana.
me too.
It's a
um,
privilege.
but so one thing I also like to do is try and give a chance for interviewees to think about if a youth is listening to this right now, if they are looking for information or resources or support, what is one message that either you wish you had known when you were younger or
Mhm.
right now you think would be helpful to someone that might be struggling?
I think young people are very intuitive about who is open and will be supportive, and just to talk about it, as soon as you can, whether that person is a teacher or a coach or a music teacher, or you have a sense of who are kind-hearted, open people, and to start talking, and because those people often know other people that they can put you in touch with. Obviously, or any groups that you hear about. I mean, if you hear of a youth group, I know at various times in Urbana High School, for instance, or uh, I don't know about Champaign Central, but I know at Urbana there have been groups or a teacher who was very gay friendly, and the gay students gravitated, and there's some support groups that have started. So anytime you hear of a group, go to that group, um, and and find those supportive people. They don't have to be gay themselves, but they'll know who are safe most of the time. And I think that's really what I did, actually, because I knew when I was 12 years old. Um, and there were people along the way that helped me. So, they weren't gay themselves. Well, one was, actually, it turned out later, I found out. But, um, and, they certainly helped affirm that this was not crazy or sick or evil or sinful. And so I just say, open up to safe people very quickly, and they'll help you connect and feel better about yourself. If that's the first step, your own self-esteem and feeling better about yourself, but also sometimes can connect you, and particularly teachers can. Like, I can't tell you how many at Parkland. How many students came and I was able to connect them, and then we started a gay lesbian organization, and I was a co-sponsor of it. Um, so I think that's the thing to do. Find those friendly teachers, coaches, ministers occasionally. Uh, so that's my advice to young people.
That's great.
Read, because there's so much now. Get on the internet, find groups to look up. The National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Look up. Oh gosh, all of a sudden I'm going blank. There's a million of them. Human rights, HRC, human rights, whatever it's called, coalition. You can find resources online also.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this, Lucas.
No, thank you very much for contacting me and being willing to participate.
Oh, I was very happy to do it. You're adorable.